expression on our face.
There goes that crazy bunch, they're really out to lunch. That bunch of jerks from outer space. We're morons, welcome to our pleasure dome. Welcome to our mobile home, up in the sky. We're morons, people say we've gone too far, but we don't know where we are and we don't know why.
You've joined the Betamax Video Club, rewinding back to our favourite films of the 1980s. My name's Rich Nelson, and tonight I've rented Morons from Outer Space. Joining me tonight is Tim Worthington, who can be found on Twitter at OutOnBlue6, host of the Looks Unfamiliar podcast. Hi Tim, how are you?
I'm fine, how are you?
I'm very good. Again, another film that you've brought to the table, which I hadn't seen in a very long time. Morons from Outer Space. Why?
Well, a number of reasons. One which I'm sure we'll come back to in a bit is I think it's been very unfairly maligned for not really any good reason. I think one person who's had to go at it has had a good reason, which I'll come around to eventually. But the other thing is, to me, in a way, even despite all the, the sort of standard legends about the films everyone in school saw that they weren't supposed to me, in a way, Morons from Outer Space is the definitive video shop film, because it was one that, for reasons I'm not quite clear on, I wasn't allowed to see in the cinema, and then later managed to get it from the video shop sort of sneakily. And you wouldn't think you'd have to sneak out Morons from Outer Space, but there was that whole weird thing around alternative comedy that anyone who was vaguely alternative was as, seen as part of a bad lot, with Rick and Aid and French and Saunders and so on. People were wary of people like Sandy Toksvig, which seems bizarre to think of now, and Tony Slattery. They were all seen as undesirables because they weren't the two Ronnies. And Smith and Jones was Mel Smith and Griffith Jones was sort of part of that as well. But Morons from Outer Space was something that I very definitely thought, I can't wait till that comes out on video and I can see that. And eventually I did.
Well, it's funny that, as you say, there are a lot of people in this film who, both at the time and with hindsight, you look back and of course Smith and Jones are the big names, very big at the time, and yet this and their other effort at getting into films, Wilf, really struggled at the box office and for any sort of critical acclaim. But they really were very big, popular comedians at the time, weren't they?
Very much so. I think it's worth saying that they were still kind of on the up at this point. Even though they'd been in Not the 9 o'clock news, they were sort of in fame terms, they were the junior partners to Rowan Atkinson and Pamela Stevenson. They were, they weren't as photogenic as, I'm sure people would dispute me saying Rowan Atkinson was photogenic, but he knew how to play to the camera, whereas sort of Mel and Griff always did kind of rock and roll dancing poses as though they were doing the twist or whatever. They weren't quite as marketable, but they just had the first series on BBC Two of A Last Smith and Jones. In fact, it finished, I think, a fortnight before Morons from Outer Space came out. And there'd also been, this is one that very few people remember, but those that do remember it really fondly. Mel Smith with a bloke called Bob Goody, who was more a sort of serious theatre actor and director, but they did a children's ITV sketch show called Smith and Goody, which was about promoting literature, but it was just them doing daft things with books. And that meant a lot to me at the time. It's one of those things that's never resurfaced. I think when Mel Smith died, there was a clip from the Christmas special, Smith and Goody on Ice, which they literally presented on an ice rink, sort of falling over. And that's all I've seen of it from that day to this. So they were still, both of them were still in the position where they did odd little things like that. I think Griffith Jones did a few pop videos around then as well, and Morons from Outer Space was quite a big step up in fame terms, really.
It was, because I remember the Kim Wilde music video that Mel Smith was in.
Oh, yes.
And I suppose even now, Griff Rhys-Jones is a household name, and he's not on the telly as much. I mean, I think he was last seen on the Celebrity Bake Off. But when you talk about the two of them in a film with, of course, looking back again, Jimmy Nail playing an alien, obviously, and something that I found really quite shocking because it didn't twig in my head. And I've got a poster of a certain film in one of our walls, which is probably going to come down soon. And the name of the director of this film was also the director of that. So I'm used to seeing this name, Mike Hodges, director of Get Carter.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is one of my favourite films from that era. He also directed Flash Gordon and later Croupier as well, which was a bit of a sleeper hit. This is a very big step away from that, and there were a lot of issues behind the scenes between, I suppose, him and Mel Smith particularly. I mean, even the title was changed drastically. In the research for this film, I actually read an article on the BFI website where the writer actually tracked down Mike Hodges and spoke to him about the film, and he was like, why? He was so taken aback that someone fondly remembered this film and talked to him from the BFI, which you'd sort of think would be a world away from it, was genuinely glowing about it. It's still fondly remembered.
Well, yeah, I mean, he was a very odd choice because I'm very fond of a lot of his films, like you say, Get Carter, Flash Gordon. He also did Pulp with Michael Caine and The Terminal Man from the 70s, which is quite a culty thing. He also did a TV series called The Tyrant King about some kids looking for stolen art. But all of those have got very funny moments in, but they are not comedy films. They've got moments of wit that don't really involve physical comedy. And whereas Mel Smith and Griff Rhys-Jones, it wasn't, in some ways it was literally in-your-face comedy, because their most famous thing was where it's the two of them head-to-head in extreme close-up, saying things to each other quite quickly, reacting quite quickly. And one big problem I noticed watching this again is there's an extended sequence where Mel's character is in an ambulance being driven to hospital and then being shunted through the hospital on the trolley. And the way that's shot, it doesn't come across as funny. It just looks horrible. You sit there thinking, ow, ooh, that's awful. He's just getting thrown about and knocked into things. It's not done in a funny way. It's done almost under the supposition that if he is thrown about, it'll be funny. And it's kind of like Tom and Jerry if there were no jokes in it.
Sort of looking at it from, I call myself an outsider to this film, it starts as it means to go on, really. There are a lot, and this film does borrow, very obviously, it's not very subtle, from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But even a film that I suppose surely must have been in some way inspired by this, Spaceballs, that seemed to be the first film that popped in my head. The opening shot of the large spaceship flying overhead, and even Mel took a step outside of the flying caravan, which was also in Spaceballs, to play a game called Spaceball. It's just the fact that they're driving a flying Winnebago with wings, we later find out is a hire car. This is 4 aliens from the planet Blob who decide, well, they're not a fan of Mel, and he goes outside, and Jimmy Nail decides, right, he's gone, let's shoot off.
Yeah, I think another thing that was influenced by it, I'm sure we're going to get a volley of catcalls from me saying this, but I think there was a fair bit of early Red Dwarf in there. Just in the whole, the make do amend style of the, parody, the broadness of the adoption of genre stereotypes. And also, that was created by Grant and Naylor, who worked on a lot of the same shows as Griff Rhys-Jones in particular as writers. They will have, I'm sure they'll have been, thought, what are our mates doing at the cinema? Let's go and see it.
Yeah.
I think some of it did feed into that. But Jimmy Nail is an odd person to be in this at that point, because he'd only done a couple of things. He'd been in Auf Wiedersehen, Pet, where he's not quite the same character in Morons from Outer Space, but he'd also been in Spy Ship, which was a very serious BBC Cold War drama. And I don't think he'd done very much else. Certainly nothing where you'd think he'd be the ideal fit to go alongside Mel and Griff. And also, it's worth saying, the two of them barely appear together in the whole film.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what anyone was playing out there.
You think your 2 big stars, obviously Mel is Bernard, I suppose, of the 4 morons, probably the most advanced.
The least moron.
Say the tallest dwarf in the village. It's and yet there's a scene quite early on when there's no intelligent life anywhere, and they cut to Griff Rhys-Jones as Graham, who works as a sort of low level for a news station. And yeah, throughout the film they don't interact. until right at the end of the film, because Mel ends up being, or Bernard as I should call him, ends up being dispatched, eventually makes his way to Arizona, while the three morons left end up somewhere outside of Hatfield, which is I went to school quite near there, and there isn't a lot going on unless they happen to go into the large outlet centre or the McDonald's where my mates were working at the time.
Yeah, I think as well, it can't decide which storyline it wants, because they both belong to separate storylines, which is Griff is part of the media trying to exploit these aliens who, I mean, it is quite an amusing conceit that they don't have anything to offer mankind. They're just popular because they're there. They've got no new technology, they've got no cures for illnesses, they've got no evil plan to take over the world. They are literally just morons from outer space. And so there's that. And Mel's storyline is weird and esoteric because he separated from them. He sort of becomes homeless and is in a hostel at one point, isn't he? And it's the two things don't really tie up. It doesn't quite become either a parody of sci-fi or a social satire or an attack on the media. It just sort of dips its toes into all three, and they don't kind of sit together that well.
The weird thing is I thought with the morons, and as you say, they're famous because they're there, not for anything they've done. And we see a lot of that as when Sandra tries singing. She's quite obviously dreadful, but every man falls at her feet. They remind me an awful lot of perhaps early Big Brother winners. They're famous for being Big Brother, but it's, Joanne Pierce, who played Sandra, really hasn't been in an awful lot since. She seems in this film to have almost a poison ivy style effect on people, where everyone falls in love and everyone is besotted with her, which of course has some benefits to it. But they sort of go off, and once Graham eventually catches up, but this is after their landing, when it is a little bit slapstick, and this spaceship caravan type vessel going up the M1, and the middle-aged couple who were stuck in front when they had their accident, they ended up in a ditch, and they said, "Oh, did you get his number? I think he was from Belgium."
Now, did that remind you of anything?
It reminded me of something out of a Roger Moore Bond film.
Well, it reminded me, again, I'm not sure this is a coincidence, but the comic strip presents Mr. Jolly Lives Next Door.
Oh, yes.
There's a very similar scene with Dawn French and who's driving with her, but where they obviously they run off the road, not by a spaceship. It's a very similar scene. And again, you think, was that a direct influence on it?
Yeah.
It's possible.
It was funny to see the traffic cops turn up. Should we put the cones out? Of course, that was the webcam legend Leslie Grantham.
Yes.
just before EastEnders. Or it's actually 1905, it probably would be about the same time EastEnders started, wouldn't it? That was a weird little spot, and that was probably their version of satire of what the police would be like, and turn up, not do anything, but chuck some cones out and make it look like you are.
Hello, just reporting a bit of congestion between exits 8 and... say 23. Looks like a spaceship of some description. Over.
Shall I put the cones out, Sarge?
Yeah, might as well.
Sweep the road for debris. They've landed, and the higher level British intelligence and the armed forces start getting involved, and it's a very interesting sort of clash of cultures, as the commander's taken from his dinner party, and there's the mayhem as the aliens are here, because the news has broken, because Graham really is the only one from the TV station who manages to get there, albeit fudges it massively to start with. And the news spreads that, we've had a first contact of sorts.
Yeah, and there is one of the few really, really brilliant gags in it is there's a kind of send up of the Close Encounters 4 notes that turns into somebody playing the entertainer on an organ. And not only that, it goes on and on and on, and while characters are begging him to stop, and he carries on. And that is really funny, because some of it's something they don't quite sit with each other. Was I think Mike Hodges was trying to parody, as you say, the Close Encounters thing, E.T., everything, the big budget sci-fi that was in vogue at that point. And he does that quite well. But on the other hand, I don't think the script, which was by Mel Smith and Griff Rhys-Jones, really goes in for the kill on that. It's a bit more like, it's like a very long version of one of their sketches where the whole point of it was just space.
Yeah.
Where, Griff would be a policeman and go like, oh, I see, sir, your UFO's being parked by E.T. and Darth Vader in Space Bay 8. Or, that it doesn't really get any more niche than that. And the two things, like, as I say, feel a bit disconnected, really.
I suppose if this was a film by perhaps Eddie Murphy, he'd have played, or Griff Rhys-Jones would have played several of the characters himself, and they would have popped up, and they would have also been the policeman doing a very brief sort of insert there. And that, while it would have obviously taken away from the story, it would have been at least that amusing part where it also references their sketch stuff and the fact that they did a lot of their best work as a pair.
Yeah, it would have been more recognisably Smith and Jones, because I have a thing about, there are very few films with TV comedians where it's obvious that they've gone to somebody with a good idea for a film and said, this will make a great film, let's make it. I mean, there's very few I can think of. I'd say Bedazzled, Peter Dudley Moore film is an example of that. But
one we did talk about on the Cannibal Run episode was The Boys in Blue by Cannon and Ballers. Perhaps not the high point of the genre, but...
Yeah, that to me would be one where somebody's just said, they're popular, get them in something. And I think you only have to look at in the script book of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's got the original script from when somebody just said, do you want to make a film? Which is dreadful. It's just very long, ponderous sketches all joined together, which later became the fourth series of Monty Python. But it's obvious that they read it back and somebody, probably Eric Idle, said, do you know what? We need an actual idea for this or we're just wasting everyone's time. And so they came up, Holy Grail was one of my favourite films ever. I don't think it would be if they'd stuck with the original format for it. But I get the impression somebody said, you two should make a film, And they went, okay, what could we do? Some aliens come to Earth.
Yeah. The film kind of then sort of straddles a few different genres. You've got the aliens landing, you've got the satire about fame and also a little bit about the British establishment in general. Part of it where you see the people turning up to the alien crash site with their signs, if you're from Venus, you can suck my lollipop, and so on. And even the weird little jokes that you say are like a sketch where Bernard tries to hitch a ride from a helicopter.
Yes.
And that's almost, when it works out that he's a male and not a female, that almost reminded me of something out of Derek and Clive, the cab drivers. There's flashes of potential brilliant comedy in there, and it's either wasted by being out of context or too short and quite easily, as I say, could have been a sketch elsewhere. But that's how he ends up in Arizona, living like we've got raccoons taped to his head and communicating with dustbins.
Yeah, he actually says, take me to your leader to a bin, doesn't he?
And then when he ends up going to a larger bin, he's like, yes, here you are. And then in a link to one of the other episodes, he is not, and this is the scene that leads to him being taken to hospital. He's run over by Shane Rimmer, who we talked about at the Superman 2 episode and was in a couple of Bond films as well.
Oh, it is, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, he's somebody where people would know his voice more than...
Yeah, well, as it was John Rain who was talking about on the previous episode, where because he was one of the many American actors living in London at the time and got a lot of work on films like Superman, Empire Strikes Back and so on, and he was animated, or he was the voice of, what was the character's name? Was it Dirk?
Oh, Dick Spanner.
And because he was in England doing that as well, so it was only a very little cameo. Yeah, that was sort of led to Bernard being hospitalised eventually, despite hitting every door and wall in the way. It didn't take him long, I suppose, if you're a semi-coherent being in a hospital talking about things like aliens and so on, you're going to be carted off to the other wing.
Yeah.
The other, it sounds horrible to call them inmates, the other patients at the hospital are split into the two camps of Hitler and Jesus, which is not subtle.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say it, I think there are elements of the film which some people might find problematic these days. Even just the title, Morons, a bit of a frowned on word these days, isn't it? And yet, it's one of the least offensive films of the 80s. So it just shows how much times can change. You know, nobody would have thought anything of the mental hospital, mental ward scenes at the time. I'm not sure that they quite hit the marks these days.
No. Something I've from listening to another podcast about WWF wrestling, and they at the time, and this was around this time actually, the sort of mid 80s, had midget matches. And of course, midget now is generally seen as a derogatory term. And the wrestling broadcasts, which are still shown virtually uncensored on their website, have to have the disclaimer at the beginning saying there's language and behaviour and conduct which we don't now tolerate. And of course, 30 years later, of course, it's easy to say that some of the things they did and dressing up in blackface and this, that and the other.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be fair, that was inappropriate at the time. They still did it. But this is something that, again, the original working title of this film was Illegal Aliens, which, while not as obviously funny, it certainly would have aged a lot better.
Yeah, and it's weird. I think it probably would have... I don't think it would have been a bigger hit. It would have been less panned by people at the time if it was called that, I think, because... that's a name that it sounds weird to say it's about a film title, but it confronts you less. It demands less of an opinion from you because Morons from Outer Space is setting out its stall, and it is a funny title. So it's almost saying the rest of the film is going to be as funny as this title, which I'm prepared to accept. Not many people think. But Illegal Aliens is kind of it's a title you have to think about to get the joke. In my experience, that immediately catches people off guard when they can't just make a prejudgment based on the title. It's something that takes them just that tiny bit of effort to get. Like, lowers your defences a little bit. I really do think that's true, to be honest with you.
You know, apparently that's one of the reasons why they fell out. Smith and Jones and Mike Hodges was about the title of the film, and it doesn't necessarily translate well for international audiences and so on. And it does immediately set you up. I mean, the writing of the four aliens, morons, whatever, sets it up straight away that, right, you don't need to think. These four people are idiots. Even though Mel Smith doesn't, again, he's not as dumb. He's not as stupid. He comes across better anyway than the other three. We're still basically encouraged to refer to him as Moron 1 or 4 or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying Mel Smith had a long track record of things just having a straightforward title. I mean, if you look at the Mr. Bean film called Bean, the tall guy, well, you have to actually see the film to know what that's referring to. That's a pretty on-the-money title. There was a stage play, The Gambler. You can't really mistake what that's about. Illegal Aliens isn't really a Mel Smith kind of title, so I can see that he probably stood his ground about it quite vociferously. I mean, even what I think was the absolute high point of their work together, which was the last Smith and Jones Christmas special in, I think it was 1987, but it's called The Homemade Christmas Video. You know exactly what to expect from that. And it does deliver on that, but they weren't ones for clever titles, so I can see where the conflict came from.
I need to reread that BFI interview. I think it was there was a part documentary and there was actually a video interview as well, which it would have been quite good. It was actually on the BFI's website. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, actually. It was sort of quite interesting when I was doing the research for this. It was clearly written by someone who was a fan. It was actually by John Spira, BFI documentary maker. Again, showing a bit of passion, which always helps when you're making a video like that. But even sort of coming back to the film, there were sequences where the three, I suppose, captured, for want of a better word, were being interrogated by the scientists, and it was like talking to sort of 4-year-old children. Really, some of the questions they were asking, and I think once they established that this is not intelligent life, these aren't people who are going to come here and solve any energy crisis or fix the environment. It doesn't take them an awful lot to perhaps look into putting them down, not necessarily humanely either. And that's when Graham, who's still loitering around the residence, actually becomes their rescuer, for want of a better word. He abandons his TV career to help them escape, which is very noble. But as we see later on, there's certainly an ulterior motive behind it.
Yeah, dollar signs in front of his eyes, really. Yeah. Which is why I don't think you could really call it a spoiler. The very last scene is he wants to represent Bernard. So,
yeah.
His cash cow's gone, so he spotted another one.
I don't think he can sing as well as Sandra did, but...
Well, that does bring me round to the theme song, credited to the Morons. I'm convinced Griff Rhys-Jones is not on that. I can only hear Mel Smith.
I might have to dig that one out on YouTube and stick that at the beginning of the podcast.
Please do, because it's the most bizarre song ever. And as far as I'm concerned, it sounds very similar to Charmless Man by Blur. I'm not saying Damon Albarn went to see Morons from Outer Space, but, might have done.
Well, he went to art school. I'm sure they must have studied it in some way.
It's set next, yeah.
But when Graham's got them back at his place, one of the things that seemed to make me laugh more than anything was the scene where, because the police and the army and everything else turn up to try and recapture them. And there is the part where they're watching the riot or the crowd outside on TV while they're inside. And he says, oh, look, he looks like he's going to throw that brick. And he goes straight for him, clonks him on the head. It was just little things like that. Stupid, simple things, but it's a comedy at the end of the day. And it's not very sophisticated, but it still works. When he sees the news, they decide, right, how can we make this work for us? And as you say, the dollar signs appear in his eyes. But this is also how Bernard decides that he's able to reconnect, because this news, and I suppose it would be worldwide news, goes around to he's still in Arizona, and because they're international stars and living the life in their hotel suite in London and drinking the pale ale and running up phone bills and so on, they go off to do a show in New York, and that's where he goes to meet them.
Well, it's literally only just occurred to me, and I can't believe I'd never thought of this before. How closely was Bernard's storyline mirroring The Man Who Fell to Earth?
Ooh.
Similar sort of locations, kind of similar, descent into the seedier side of life. But, I mean, obviously, Morons from Outer Space is played for laughs a bit. So I don't think anyone could ever accuse The Man Who Fell to Earth of being played for laughs. But no. I do wonder if that was one of the things Mike Hodges was picking out, really.
Something that I think it's so obviously, and I don't think they're trying to pretend otherwise, that it's borrowed from other films. And to be honest, it's still an alien thing. There's only so much you can do with it. And especially back then with, effects as they were. And sometimes those level of effects actually make it more authentic. Everything around it from chat shows that they're on, which, funnily enough, is very similar to a sort of chat show that was on the previous podcast we did about absolute beginners, where sort of divides start to appear. When Bernard, who's still in America, goes to the sheriff to say that I'm the fourth alien, because this is where they've let it slip that there is a fourth one. The funny bit is that he says, yeah, and there's a huge queue of people dressed as aliens also claiming the same thing. Because he's, Mel Smith, I do wonder how would they test. He's not your alien that's green with antenna and 5 eyes or something. I do wonder what the sort of test that would be. I'm
just reminded of, the standard thing in Doctor Who in, the early days when he was knocked unconscious on Earth, and a doctor would go, some joker's messing about, this blood's not human. that sort of thing. I'm sure. I'm just picturing that sort of carry on, really.
But even there are still well-written lines sort of tucked away when the aliens are. Sort of one of them says, "Oh well, they're clearly bored with their lot, and they're finding this constant touring of their fame exhausting. So we're thinking of retiring." Graham says, "Well, you haven't done anything yet."
That's actually the highlighted quote for the film on IMDb. I did notice it. Yeah.
Oh, is it? Okay. and that's sort of clever in its way, because and it's true, because I suppose they're putting across that it's almost like they are starting to become aware that they're being exploited. The film kind of aims you down a way that you don't want to give them too much credit for being clever, but again, they're still human-ish and still seem to have these emotions. Eventually he manages to convince them to go out and do their concert, which goes incredibly badly. It's the sort of thing that would be on YouTube as a howler. I noticed that was filmed at Wembley Stadium, which they did quite well to get.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is that Mel and Griff were back there shortly afterwards, because people forget they did some of the links on Live Aid as a policeman. Well, when was Griff not a policeman, but saying that somebody complained about the noise? So obviously Morons from Outer Space didn't dent their career too badly, because a couple of months later we're on the biggest concert ever held, alongside, the absolute giants of rock. So it didn't do that much damage, really.
I suppose you look at some of the contemporaries of even now, and I think people like, maybe not in the same film, but, even like Little Britain, which was, 15 years ago, really, that started. And Matt Lucas and David Walliams have been in various films to varying degrees, and people like that. And I suppose that the less we say about Ant and Dec's effort at aliens and so on, the better.
Have you ever seen the Smack the Pony film?
No, I haven't.
Gladiatress, which it was about 3 years after Gladiator as well. It's fairly dreadful. And, the Mitchell and Webb one, Magicians, I think, was a...
That seemed just, again, like trying to capitalise on Peep Show and the fact that they were quite big. I suppose they still are to an extent. And this is the part where I guess this, whether it serves as a warning or an encouragement to some, the vanity of a comedy act and even comedians or others trying to be virtually exploited by making the most of their fame while they still can. Even 33 years later, it still kind of echoes that you can imagine something similar happening. I know it might not be Ant and Dec, because the one with the big head seems to be going through some issues at the time of recording. It's not going to be long before the next big thing seems to make a foray into cinema or something like that.
But I think it is worth really emphasising about Morons from Outer Space that it isn't quite of a piece with all those disasters. It's a film that underachieves very badly, but it's not a bad film, and it has a reputation of being a bad film. And that's completely undeserved. It clocks in at a decent time. It doesn't let up with the story or with the comedy. It doesn't quite work, but it doesn't not work either. And I don't like the way it's the butt of every joke about comedians doing films, because there are more deserving targets than it, really.
I think this, and from looking at it with those fresh pair of eyes, I remember parents watching it, which is how I sort of saw it when I was a lot younger. There are some very funny bits in here, and I think had it been a more, whether it's to do with the production or the writing or however it works, it's a lot less than the sum of its parts, which I suppose, yes, there are parts of this which are dreadful and silly and really don't belong, but there is a lot of merit in there. And particularly Mel Smith's performance, I found quite impressive. The fact that, but then this is the part in that he didn't really interact with the other three, or even with Griff Rhys-Jones, acting as someone who gets taken in as someone with mental health issues rather than being an alien. Yes, it's not a great film, but I think there were parts of it that had quite a lot of merit, and certainly some of the writing, some of the script was quite sharp and quite clever.
I think what I have actually heard one valid criticism of it which this is going to take some explaining, but Stuart Lee and Richard Herring used to do a thing called extra final scenes where they do a sort of sketch, adding a bit to the end of the film. Like there's the Braveheart one where they question about the historical inaccuracies at the end of it and things like that. But the Morons from Outer Space one was Mel Smith and Griff Rhys-Jones hand back their fee and say sorry to everyone, which seems a bit sneery, but there is actually context because to them, and I think to Richard in particular has said this a lot, not the 9 o'clock news were kind of like their rock stars, their pop idols. And when you're young, when you invest in somebody like that, I mean, this happened to me with Vic Reeves. This gets me a lot of brickbats when I say this, but when, you think somebody's brilliant and they do something that you see them slip up in public, and you think, I don't like that as much, that can hit you quite hard at a young age. And so that was, their thing with Morons from Outer Space was they had a lot of time for Mel and Griff, and, then they do this film that really isn't up to the same standard. And I can see it from that point of view, actually.
Out of interest, what was the Vic Reeves thing?
Vic Reeves, for me, was... there is this whole myth that they were discovered from nowhere for Big Night Out, which, is completely wrong because they've been on other programmes. And I remember seeing the trailer for Big Night Out and thinking, oh, they've got a series now, I'll watch that. And I loved Big Night Out. I loved The Weekenders as well, the pilot they did for Channel 4. I didn't like them when they appeared as themselves on chat shows, was a big problem. And then I never liked The Smell of Breeze and Mortar and Shooting Stars as much, which people don't believe when I say that, but genuinely, they just didn't grab me in the same way. Oh, and I remember feeling that kind of, not crushing disappointment, but a bit kind of, I'm a bit sad that this isn't for me anymore. Irano. You're going to get complaints about that now.
Well, no, the interesting thing is, I've sort of given away the time this is being recorded, but the latest Adam Buxton podcast where he speaks to Bob Mortimer about this and Shooting Stars, and he's almost excusing it to a point of saying it's more mainstream because of the fact that there are regular celebrities on there. And I suppose that was their in, and that was what got them the most figures, purely because someone who hadn't watched them before could tune in and say, oh, there's someone off EastEnders, or there's someone off Blur, or whatever. In an alternate universe, Vic and Bob would have done a film something similar to this.
Well, I mean, now I'm older, you can rationalise these things easily and just say, well, it was clearly good, it just wasn't for me anymore. People that you recognise from EastEnders is fine, but, it's not Sir Lloyd Crisp, the disappearing hazelnut man, which is the sort of thing that I laughed at. But when you're younger, you do invest more in creative people in the public eye, and it can be more of a... like when a band suddenly does an album that's not as good. Yeah. And, when you're younger and it means a lot to you, that can be a problem. So I can see that there were people probably to whom, Mel and Griff and people like that were kind of on a par with punk, really. Yeah. Certainly, I do know people who loved Rick Mayall who, again, I don't agree with this, but didn't like The New Statesman and thought that was him stepping into cosy sitcom land. And, that felt like a betrayal to them. I don't buy that at all because I love The New Statesman. That's slightly off at a tangent, really.
Well, no, but I mean, it's, we're still in the same sport, I guess, and I suppose we can just be grateful that Twitter wasn't around back then.
I've never searched for Morons from Outer Space on Twitter because I think it might make me very angry. There'd be a lot of Morons from Outer Space, lol, in response to something Theresa May's done or something like that. But
well, maybe she is from outer space, I don't know. But weirdly, that when I put on a picture on Twitter that's saying, I'm watching Morons from Outer Space, and I did have a couple of comments going, oh my God, why, what have you let yourself in for? And it's kind of like, well, and I'll say that with this Twitter account, it's quite obvious why.
Yeah. But also, what day and time were you watching it?
It was Sunday evening.
There's not much good on the telly at that point. There's much worse things on the TV. So I think you can't really criticise somebody for watching Morons from Outer Space.
The kids were in bed, and I don't watch Antiques Roadshow. There's your answer. Well, thank you for bringing it to my attention again. I know we talked about this a few months ago, and like most of the films that I have watched as part of this that I wasn't so familiar with, it's nice to see or to try and look for positives. You know, this isn't a podcast just about slating films, and yeah, there are a lot of bits in this that I thought, Jesus, this is rubbish, but there were parts of it that I genuinely enjoyed and thought were actually very clever. So again, you know, and hopefully it's enhanced or at least raised it in my mind a little bit, and I suppose that's all we can hope for.
But will you go out and read the book of this one, though?
Well, bear in mind, Absolute Beginners, I read half of it while my wife was in a maternity ward and still haven't finished. I'll see if the script is available on eBay for this. Yeah, so or maybe I'll stick to some of the more Mike Hodges films that I'm familiar with, or at least an excuse to track down some of Smith and Jones' back catalogue, which I suppose is more enjoyable. Well, Tim, again, thank you very much for joining us. Your Looks Unfamiliar podcast is going from strength to strength. What can people expect from you in the future?
Let me think. Well, I've got a couple of guests lined up. So I like to make sort of mix it up and have names and non-names. I mean, one person who's going to be on it is just one of my friends from that I've known from down the pub since I was about 18. So, there will be more names on there, and there'll be more people you've never heard of, and that's how I like it, really.
Good, yeah.
I like discovering new people through things. I mean, I subscribe to the Theme Park podcast where you had one of the presenters on recently, and it's always good to discover new things as well as hearing people that you know well. But
with that podcast where, you know, people are talking about things that they remember from either their childhood or from a while ago, that it's something that, especially now with the resources we have at our fingertips, I suppose we can find things a little bit easier, whether it's YouTube or eBay or whatever, where we can have a look and say, you know what, I might give that a try. That's a good thing, I think.
Yep.
Someone that was sent my way from you, Ben Baker, is going to be joining me very soon to talk about one of the films that I think was voted the worst of all time.
Ah, God, I've got a good idea what he's picked.
Yeah, I know. It's a film I remember fondly from my youth, so that's a treat for that later down the line. We're recording that one, well, next week from now anyway, so God help us all. Well, again, Tim, thanks very much. So it's Out on Blue 6 is your Twitter handle.
It is, yeah.
Looks Unfamiliar is the podcast. And I'm going to play us out before I get caught for late fees. The song that was number one when this film was released, 29th of March 1985, it was Easy Lover. So, yeah.
Which doesn't sound that dissimilar to the theme song.
Maybe I'll dig that one out as well and play them at the same time. Tim, thank you very much for joining us, and I look forward to whatever you bring to my doorstep next time.
This podcast is part of Britpod Scene, an independent network of uniquely British podcasts that's always growing. Check out BritpodScene.com or Britpod Scene on Twitter to find out more.